we will be also providing some practical seminars, like, for example, machine learning for finance or for healthcare, etc. So really the point for me is to create more more interaction between people who are attending these lectures. So really feel free to contact other guys, and we will try to provide at least a website where all the lectures will be there. And feel free if you have any questions. And thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Ahmed. So now it's to the time for Hamza to start the lecture. Go on, Hamza. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thanks a lot. Thank you, Abdul Rahman, François, and Ahmed. So yes, so thank you all for coming actually to the last session. Yeah, so probably actually I'll be a bit brief because it's the last session. So I'll be talking about Newton methods, so second order methods in this session. So first, this is something, I mean, if you read any literature on optimization, we always have this divide. You see what people call first order methods and what people call second order methods. So a first order optimization method is a method that only uses gradient information. So first order Taylor approximation information. So this means the gradient. And so far, all the algorithms that we have seen are indeed first order methods. We only relied on the gradient of the function that we're trying to minimize, or the subgradient if it's a non-smooth function. So now the question is, can we use second derivatives to design faster algorithms? Okay, so this is the point of second order methods. And the prototypical, I mean, the main second order method that one should have in mind, and I'm sure actually many of you will have already studied, is what we call Newton's method. Okay, so I'm going to present what Newton's method is. Maybe the basic property that one should know and that one should remember about Newton's method is quadratic convergence, and this I will explain, and we will give a very simple overview of the proof of why this phenomenon happens. And then I will explain how Newton's method is really the workhorse, I mean, in the modern algorithms to solve linear programming and quadratic programming problems. Okay, so these are the methods that are used, for example, I mean, to solve model predictive control problems, the ones that I showed. I mean, one example that I showed earlier in this session, this morning. Okay, so let's start with the definition of what is Newton's method. It's a very simple. The motivation is very simple. So I want to minimize a function f of x. Okay, again, I assume that my function is convex, and so what I do is I do a second order Taylor approximation of my function. Okay, so this is a Taylor approximation to the second order. So Taylor approximation to the second order. Okay, and remember that this this notation I use here, this is the Hessian of my function. And so if I just make sure we're on the same page, so the ij entry of the Hessian is just the second partial derivative of f with respect to xi and xj. Okay. So we know that if my function f is convex, we know that the Hessian is a positive semi-definite matrix. All its eigenvalues are non-negative. If it's strongly convex, I know that it's a positive definite matrix, so it's non-singular. Okay. So what I can do, so this is a quadratic. So what I have on the right-hand side, this is a quadratic that's pointing upward. It's a convex quadratic that in the case of a strongly convex function has a unique minimum, okay? And Newton's method exactly corresponds to doing this. So at iteration xk, you form the Taylor expansion up to second order, and xk plus 1 is just, is going to be the minimum of your Taylor approximation, of this Taylor approximation. Okay, so if I want to minimize a quadratic, I just set the gradient to be 0. So the gradient of the right-hand side with respect to h is, so maybe I can write here. So the gradient of the second order approximation, with respect to h is gradient f at xk plus Hessian of f times h. Okay, so if I want to minimize the convex quadratic, then I have to set this to be 0. And so this is the equation I have to solve. And so this gives me the formula. The Hessian here is a matrix, so this gives me the formula for the step I need to do. Okay, so h star is essentially how I'm going to move up from xk. Okay, so and so the Newton's method really is xk plus 1 is equal to xk minus the Hessian of f at xk inverse times the gradient of f at xk. Okay, it's very simple to rederive if you forgot the formula. If you forget this formula with the Hessian inverse and so on, you just form the second order Taylor approximation and you differentiate, and this gives you the expression. Okay, so this is the vanilla or the default kind of Newton's method. The more general Newton method that we apply in practice, we typically put a step size that can be different from 1. Okay, so the general Newton method is exactly what I've just written, where you choose a step size here, where we put a step size. Okay, and this step size can be chosen by doing a line search, like I explained in the very first sessions on gradient method. You can do something like a backtracking line search or something like that. Okay, this is the this picture that you see in the middle here illustrates the method. Okay, so this is f. This is the quadratic approximation of f around xk. Okay, and this point, the point that you see here, so xk plus 1, is the point that minimizes this quadratic approximation. Okay, so this is Newton's method. You see that one main difference with the gradient method. So obviously it uses the Hessian, it uses the second derivatives, but this is how I mean, we said that we're going to use second derivatives. But the main difference with the gradient method is that each iteration now requires inverting a matrix or requires solving a linear system, which is the linear system that you see here. Okay. And so if I care about implementing this, about computational complexity, I need to care about how fast can I solve this linear system. Okay, so generically, the problem of solving a generic linear system of size n by n is n cubed floating point operations. Okay, so you can do this, I mean, for a generic linear system, you can do this by doing an LU decomposition, which is equivalent to a Gaussian elimination. Here, the Hessian happens to be positive semi-definite or positive definite because my function is convex. So typically what one will do is a Cholesky decomposition. And then you will to get the solution of the linear system, and this scales like n cubed. Okay, and so this is problematic when n is large. Okay, so when n is of the order of thousands, you can see that you need quite a lot of flops. You need at least 1 billion flops. This is, I mean, on modern computers that is okay, but for n larger than, I mean, for n larger than this number, then it starts. You can start to see that the iterates are become very slow. And I want you to compare this with the gradient method, where each iteration of the gradient method just updates a vector. Okay, so xk plus 1 is xk minus the gradient of f at xk with a step size. And so adding vectors of size n, this you just need to add each component. And so this requires a number of flops that is linear in n. Okay, so you have a difference between n cubed and n, and this difference can be quite significant. Okay, so this is something extremely important to keep in mind here, that the iterations of the Newton method are costly in general. I mean, generically, if you do not exploit any structure of the Hessian matrix. Okay, so despite this fact, I mean, okay, so you pay more in each iteration of the Newton's method, but then you also gain a bit. So you're using some more information about the function. So we hope that the convergence is going to be faster than the gradient method. And indeed, the convergence of Newton's method is extremely fast. provided that you start close enough to the solution. Okay, and so this is one main characteristic of Newton's method that one has to, that is kind of one signature, if you want, of Newton's method, is its quadratic convergence, meaning that, which kind of can be seen on this plot. So here, if you look at the plot of f of xk minus the minimum with the iterations, the quadratic convergence is seen in this piece of the plot in here. Okay, so we know that if I have linear convergence, then on a log plot, I essentially have a straight line. Okay, and this means that f of xk minus f star decreases like a number gamma to the power k, where gamma is less than 1. Okay, this Newton's method close to a solution converges even faster than this. Okay, and I will explain what I mean exactly by quadratic convergence, but just to tell you that it's faster even than linear convergence. But this is provided that you're close enough to the solution. Another property that I kind of forgot to mention here, and that is written on the slide, is, so you remember we've seen the gradient method. We've seen that the gradient method is depends on the scaling of your problem. So if you take an optimization problem, you want to minimize f of x, and you run the gradient method, and let's say that you rescale the variables. Okay, so you rescale the first variable, you multiply it by 10, and the second variable multiply it by 5, and so on and so forth. And you run gradient method, the iterates will be different, and the performance can be very different. So it could be that for one scaling, gradient method converges much faster than in another scaling. And we've seen this behavior by remember the zigzagging. If you apply gradient method to a quadratic that is badly scaled, so if you apply gradient method to a quadratic function whose level sets are kind of skewed ellipses, so we've seen that if you run gradient method, it will kind of oscillate until it reaches the optimal point, the origin here. Whereas if you rescale the ellipses so that they're circles, then the gradient method will just go straight directly to the optimal point. Now, the gradient method is not affected by the scaling. The Newton's method is the same, has exactly the same performance or the same iterates, no matter how you rescale your problem. So a consequence of this fact that you can see here is that Newton's method, actually it converges in one iteration to the optimal solution, converges in one iteration if your function is quadratic. And kind of this is obvious from the way I derive Newton's method, because if you have a quadratic function and you just do the Taylor expansion, that's the function itself. So you're minimizing the function itself. So Newton's method is not affected by a change of coordinates, and you can I mean this is an exercise that you can verify very easily. But essentially, if you want to write it down explicitly, it means that if I erase this piece here, so it says that if you apply Newton's method to minimize f, let's say that you get iterates xk. Okay, so now I can do a change of variable. I can define y to be equal to px. Okay, and so I can define g of y. Okay, the function g of y to be just f of so f of the corresponding x, so f of p inverse y. Okay, and now you can think about applying Newton's method to g. Okay, so now what you can show is that Newton's method applied to g will yield iterates that are exactly yk are equal to p times xk. Okay, so it will have exactly the same performance as a Newton's method applied to the original function, up to obviously this this change of transformation. Okay, and this is a very desirable property to have of any optimization algorithm. So now let's kind of focus a bit more on this quadratic convergence, which I mentioned is kind of is the signature of Newton's method. So this is really the theorem that one can prove. I mean, there are many statements that one can write to formalize the quadratic convergence of Newton's method. This is probably the simplest one, and it has a very simple proof. So assume that F is M strongly convex, and assume that the Hessian is M Lipschitz. Okay, so that the Hessian is kind of regular. So here I'm defining a certain sequence Rk, okay, which, I mean, roughly speaking, is just the magnitude of the gradient of F at xk. And so obviously the magnitude of the gradient, this is a measure of how far you are from the optimal point. Okay, because at optimality the gradient is equal to 0. So Rk being small means that you are close to the optimum. Okay, now the claim is that with Newton's method, this sequence Rk has the following behavior, that Rk plus 1 is less than Rk squared. Okay, so this is really, I mean, just to make sure, this is really Rk squared. Okay, and what we have here is that so obviously if you do the iterations, then this gives you Rk is less than R0 to the power 2 to the power k. Okay, so if R0 is less than 1, this is extremely fast convergence to 0. So just to kind of make this point clear, you can see that if R0, just to make sure, if R0 is just 10 to the minus 1, okay, you can see that R1 is going to be less than 10 to the minus 2. Okay, that's the power of the square of R0. And then R2 is less than 10 to the power minus 4. And then R3 is less than 10 to the power minus 8. Okay, so really in 3 iterations, you've reached 10 to the minus 8, which is, and if you do just 1 more iteration, you actually reach machine precision. Okay, so you reach 10 to the minus 16, and this is machine precision. So, so really, Newton's method, if you reach the region of quadratic convergence, you just need 3-4 iterations maximum to reach extremely high accuracy for your problem. Okay, so this is, you can see that this is extremely fast convergence. And this is this part in here. This is the quadratic convergence. Okay. So kind of to make this this precise, let me, I mean, this theorem has a simple proof. So I thought maybe I could just kind of give it here. It's relatively simple. So the idea is just to so remember that xk plus 1. So this is, by the way, for unit step size. So xk plus 1 is xk plus h, and this is xk minus the Hessian of f at xk inverse times the gradient of f at xk. Okay, and so now I want to look at the gradient of f at xk plus 1. Okay, I'm interested in bounding the norm of the gradient of f at xk plus 1 in terms of the norm of the gradient of f at xk. So I'm going to use something that I already used when analyzing the gradient method. So I'm going to write this as the gradient of f at xk plus the integral from 0 to 1 of the Hessian of f at xk plus th times h dt. Okay, I already used such a formula, and I said that this is just the fundamental theorem of calculus applied to the function, the gradient function. Okay. Yes, so we have this this equality, and now note that by definition of h, this is the gradient of f at the gradient of f at xk is nothing but minus the Hessian of f at xk times h. Okay, this is by definition of h. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to do something very simple. I'm just going to put this inside the integral. So this is the integral from 0 to 1 of the Hessian of f at xk plus th minus the Hessian of f at xk times h dt. Okay. So now I'm just going to take the norms. I mean, on each side of the equality. So I get that the norm of the gradient of f at xk plus 1 Okay, and I'm going to use the triangular inequality. So this is less than the integral from 0 to 1 of the norm of the Hessian of f at xk plus 1 minus Hessian of xk at xk plus th minus the Hessian of f at xk times h, okay, dt. Yes. Okay, and now I'm going to use the fact that the Hessian is a Lipschitz, it has a Lipschitz constant of m. So I can bound this by the norm of the Hessian of f at xk plus th minus the Hessian of f at xk times the norm of h. Okay, and now this is less than m times t norm of h times norm of h. Okay, so this is really m times t norm of h squared. Okay, I use the fact that the Hessian is m Lipschitz, which is the assumption I had in my result, in my theorem. Okay, so to kind of summarize, what I get is that this is less than the integral from 0 to 1 of m t norm of h squared dt. Okay, so if you work out what this is, so this is really m divided by 2 times the norm of h squared. And if I plug in what h is, so this is m over 2 times the norm of the Hessian of f at xk inverse times the gradient of f at xk. Okay, so now I have what I wanted. So I had a bound on the norm of the gradient of f at xk plus 1 in terms of the norm of the gradient of f, but I have a gradient of f at xk inverse that I would like to get rid of here. So this one. Okay, so I'm just going to use the fact that my function is strongly convex. Okay, so remember, so since f is strongly convex, okay, so the smallest eigenvalue of the Hessian is at least m. Okay, and in turn, this implies that the largest eigenvalue of the inverse is less than m inverse. Okay. So, by the way, I should have a square here. So this means, then this implies that the norm of the Hessian of f at xk inverse times the gradient of f at xk squared, I can bound this guy by 1 over m squared times the norm of the gradient of f at xk squared. Okay, so so now the proof is done, because what I get is the norm. If I just recap, I get that the norm of the gradient of f at xk plus 1 is less than m divided by 2m squared times the norm of the gradient of f at xk squared. Okay, and so now if I multiply on each side by m divided by 2m squared, what I get is m divided by 2m squared of this guy is less than this. Sorry, is less than. Oops. I can move essentially the square like this. Okay. And this was my RK plus 1, and this was my RK. Okay, so this is the proof. This is probably the simplest way to, mathematically justify this quadratic convergence of the Newton's method. We put some assumptions to make things easy. There are some more advanced proofs that, with different assumptions on f. But I think this is a simplest a simple way to kind of justify this quadratic convergence. So, okay, so this is the so we've seen that Newton's method has a very good convergence property when started close enough to the solution. Okay, and how do you see this local behavior? This is really in when R0 is less than 1. Okay, R0 less than 1 means that the norm of the gradient has to be less than something. So this means that you have to be close enough to the solution. So really, this quadratic convergence only happens when you start close enough to the solution. Outside of this, the behavior of Newton's method can actually be bad. I mean, you can find examples where Newton's method doesn't even converge if you start far enough from the solution and if you use a unit step size. Okay, so that's why in general one needs to have to put a step size and not use the default version of taking tk to be equal to 1. This is so that it converges from globally. Okay, so let's now, I wanted to say a word about quasi-Newton methods. So I mentioned that the main difficulty in using Newton's method is the need to invert a matrix at each iteration. And I said that this takes a big O of n cubed. So that's the reason, I mean, what people have come up with in order to cope with this problem is so-called quasi-Newton methods. Okay, so a quasi-Newton method has a very similar structure as a Newton method, except that the Hessian matrix is replaced by some other matrix, which I call HK, and HK is an approximation of the Hessian, plays the role of an approximation of the Hessian, and it is there to, okay, so I mentioned here to avoid explicit computation of the Hessian to kind of form this matrix, and kind of maybe more importantly is to have more efficient evaluation of the inverse of HK times the gradient of f at xk. Okay, so so typically the way these quasi-Newton methods are implemented is that there is an efficient update rule for this HK, this approximation HK. So it's an update rule for both HK and HK inverse. Okay, and these updates typically are less expensive than a Newton method, and they typically cost only n squared floating point operations instead of n cubed floating point operations. So there are different types of quasi-Newton methods depending on how you actually form this approximation. It's kind of a long topic, which I will not get into. But maybe let me just mention one which is kind of a popular one, whose abbreviation is BFGS for Broyden, Fletcher, Goldfarb, and Shano, for 4 researchers that came up with this method. And this is based on an iterative update, as I mentioned, of HK and its inverse, and each iteration only costs n squared instead of n cubed. Okay, so this allows you to get, this is a big improvement. And I will not put the formula and so on for the update, but let me just mention that in one dimension, what this approach would corresponds to, so it corresponds to approximating the Hessian or the second derivative by a finite difference approximation of the derivatives. Okay, so you approximate f double prime by a finite difference of f primes at the different iterates. So the performance of these quasi-Newton methods is quite good. So they compare well with Newton's method. So this is again, this is a slide I took from Lieven. So on the problem of minimizing, you can see this function. So it's a linear function C transpose X minus a certain a summation of some logarithmic terms. So this is a problem that is very important when solving linear programs, and this is what I will talk about when discussing path following methods. So this is the kind of optimization problem you have to repeatedly solve when solving a linear program. So you can see that Newton's method has this quadratic convergence, okay, and convergence in very few number of iterations. So in 12 iterations, you reach very good accuracy. BFGS has the same overall structure. I mean, the kind of how f of xk approaches f star. We also see kind of this very fast convergence here, but the number of iterations you can see is much larger. Okay. So BFGS in practice is a popular alternative to Newton's method because it doesn't require you to form the Hessian. I mean, it forms an approximation of the Hessian by itself. And I think for example, in MATLAB, I think some of the functions do use some of the functions in the optimization toolbox do use some kind of BFGS method to solve the optimization problems that you give. So okay, so yes, so I wanted to give maybe another interpretation of that is important to have in mind of Newton's method and Quasi-Newton method and so on, which is the so-called variable metric interpretation. So so we know, I mean, the first order Taylor approximation of a function around a point x, okay, so is given by this formula, okay, and now if we want to have if we want to define a certain steepest descent direction, so the direction where the function moves the most, then this is one way of defining it. So you fix a norm, okay, so you fix a certain way to measure the magnitude of vectors, and you look for the direction where the function f has the largest, has the smallest, in this case, the most negative directional derivative. And you have to normalize things, so you use this norm to normalize this this v. Okay. So essentially, it is really the solution of the minimum of the gradient of f of x transpose v. So this is the term that you see here. Okay, this is essentially just the directional derivative of f in the direction v. Okay, and you seek the one that minimizes this thing, subject to a certain normalization condition on v. Okay, and the direction will in general depend on which normalization you put on v, so which norm you actually choose. So so the gradient method corresponds to choosing the Euclidean norm. So if you minimize the gradient of f of x transpose v subject to the Euclidean norm of v is equal to 1, then the solution is given by v is equal to the negative gradient. This is a consequence of Cauchy-Schwarz, essentially. Okay, that yes, that this minimum is attained when the two vectors are proportional. Okay, so so now the Newton's method can actually be understood in this framework, where the notion of norm here might sound like a weird notion of norm, but it's actually one that is quite useful to consider, and it is a norm induced by the function. Okay, so because here I'm dealing with convex functions, the Hessian of a function at x is a positive definite, so I'm assuming it's strongly convex. So the Hessian is positive definite, so I can use it to define a norm. I can use it to define a metric. Okay, and the metric is given by this formula. Okay, so it's v transpose the Hessian of f at x v. So note that the metric depends on the location on x. So that's why it's called variable metric interpretation. Okay, and so if you use this notion of metric, then the direction of steepest descent is given by this formula here, and this coincides with Newton's method, with the direction that we choose in Newton's method. Okay. Okay, I'm not doing the calculations, but this is really what you get. I mean, these are fairly simple calculations to do. They're all based on some kind of Cauchy-Schwarz. So, okay, so now if you the Quasi-Newton method is very similar. So the Quasi-Newton method corresponds to another metric, and the metric is just given by the HK, your approximation of the Hessian. Okay. And I mean, the reason I also mentioned this is that there are more recent methods that have been proposed, something called, for example, ADA-grad. So ADA is for adaptive. Okay, so this is for adaptive. That is based on, that is quite popular in machine learning. So that is based on a diagonal variable metric. Okay, so it's based on choosing HK to be a certain diagonal that you construct along the algorithm. Okay, so it's, I mean, you can compare it to something like Quasi-Newton, but then because HK is diagonal, the inverse of a diagonal matrix is very simple. It's just a rescaling of the gradient. So you still maintain the per iteration complexity of being linear. Okay, but you gain some adaptivity, and you try to incorporate some of the curvature of f in your algorithm without incurring the n cubed cost at each iteration of Newton's method. Yes. Okay. So this is kind of one important interpretation of Newton's method. In fact, one of the finer analysis of Newton's method really heavily relies on this interpretation. So in fact, you kind of, the way you analyze Newton's method is really by working in this, by relying on this variable metric, by relying on this norm that depends on your point x. Okay. So really, I should write a norm x here. Okay, so yes, so let's see, what do I have next? Okay, so now so now what I would like, so I've this is an extremely brief overview of Newton's method. I really there is lots of things to say about Newton's method. I've just kind of presented the main idea, which is based on doing a quadratic approximation of the function and minimizing it. So this gives you the direction, and generally you need to choose a step size to make it globally convergent for convex functions. And kind of, again, I mentioned the main property to remember about Newton's method is its extremely fast convergence if you start close enough to the solution. Okay? This is the key thing to remember about it. So what I would like to do now is to explain how one can use Newton's method to solve the problems that I discussed in this morning, which are linear programming, quadratic programming, and semi-definite programming. What are the algorithms that have been implemented in these packages that I mentioned, okay, to solve these problems? So for the case of linear programming, I mentioned there is already an existing algorithm, an old one called the simplex method, which is based on extreme points and going through the extreme points and so on. Okay, I will not discuss this algorithm, even though it's a very competitive algorithm and it's and it performs very well. I will discuss another algorithm that has some advantages, and the main advantage of this algorithm that I'm going to describe is that it extends very easily. The framework extends very easily to the case of quadratic programs and to semi-definite programs, whereas the framework of the simplex method really is very is just for the linear programming case where you have a polyhedron and where you know that the solution will show up, will be at an extreme point. Okay? Whereas the algorithm that I will present has a more continuous flavor to it. Okay, so let me try to present. I mean, the algorithm I'm going to explain is I'm going to just give again the overview of the main ideas. Okay, the actual theory and implementation is much more sophisticated, and there are whole books written about such methods, such path following methods, or these are also called sometimes interior point methods. Okay, or also you can call them homotopy methods. I mean, that's another name, but it's a bit less used. Okay. So I'm going to take the example of linear programming, and I'm going to explain just in the last slide how this can be extended to quadratic programming and semi-definite programming. But I'm just going to take the case of linear programming to make things concrete and simple. Okay. So really the main idea, so in linear programming, what we want to do is to minimize a linear function subject to linear inequality constraints. Okay, and the main kind of so what we have to know how to do is how to deal with these constraints. Okay, so the approach in path following methods is to rephrase this problem as an unconstrained problem for a function that is going to, so I'm going to essentially take these constraints, okay? I'm going to take these constraints and I'm going to move them to the objective function in order to penalize being close to the boundary. So, okay, so let's, yes, so one may kind of argue that I mean, how can I do this? Because I know that the solution will actually lie in the boundary. And so this is exactly where the path following idea will come, is that we will kind of parameterize this barrier function that we put. So this, this function that blows up at infinity at the boundary, we're going to parameterize it in a certain way that it becomes very, very flat as this parameter t goes to infinity. Okay, so let me, maybe it's easier to kind of draw some pictures. So so let's see. So let's so remember the geometric picture of linear programming I presented this morning. So I want to I have a certain polyhedron. Okay, so remember this is, for example, A1, this is A2, and so on. Okay, and I would like to minimize a certain cost function, and we said that the optimal point is going to be in here. Okay. So the idea is the following: is that I'm going to define a certain function that is only defined in the interior of this polyhedron. So I'm going to call here P is the set of X such that X is less than B. Okay. And now, so let's define, which is the formula I had in the previous slide. So f of x to be just C transpose x, okay, minus 1 over t times the sum from I equals 1 to m of the log of bi minus ai transpose x. Okay. So the key thing to note here is that this guy will blow up to infinity when I approach the boundary of P. When I approach, when x, not when I, when x approaches the boundary of P. Okay, so if I were to draw the level sets of this function f of x, so these are the sets where f takes a constant value. Okay, what you will see typically is something like this. So, something like this, and then it will be, okay, so the values in the middle, the value is small, and then it keeps growing until, and then it reaches infinity at the boundary of P. So you really should think of some kind of a ball that reaches infinity at the boundary. And yes, so this is kind of, this is what we call by a barrier function. Okay, so these are the level sets. These are the level sets of minus the summation of log bi minus ai transpose x. Okay, so now what path following, the idea of path following methods is the following: is that you take this function, which is usually called the barrier function. So this is called a barrier function. Okay, and you add it to the objective function that you want, which remember is C transpose X. This is the function that we want to minimize on the polyhedron. Okay, and so if I define the minimizer of f, so if I call this guy ft of x, okay, so so you can see that if t is very, very large, okay, if t is very, very large, then, or rather, sorry, so if t is very, very small, okay, if t is small, then the term in purple is negligible in front of the term, the right term, okay? So that really the barrier term is what dominates, okay? So when t is small, okay, the minimizer of ft doesn't really see the C transpose X piece. But as you let t increase, okay, as you let t increase, then actually this weight term, the 1 over t, will go to 0, and you will recover slowly what the objective function that you're interested in really is C transpose X. Okay, so what I mean by this, I mean the consequence of this is really that if I draw the curve, so if I draw the curve x star of t, okay, so this you can say that this may be x star of 0, okay, and then there is a certain curve that's x star at t. Okay, x star of t is really the argmin of ft of x, okay, on the domain of ft of x. So obviously ft of x is defined as the set of x such that ax is strictly less than b. Okay, so I hope this kind of makes sense a little bit. So x star, this is equal to x star at infinity. Okay, because when t goes to infinity, this term, that the 1 over t, will go to 0, and you will just recover the linear function. Okay, so the whole idea of path following methods is to actually follow this path. So what you do is that you will start, we assume that we have a certain value x star of t1 that is given to us, or of t0 that is given to us. And then we will use this to compute x star of something slightly bigger than t1, and then something slightly bigger, and so on and so forth, until we actually converge to x star. And so the way we're going to do this is exactly by doing Newton's method. So we are going to use x star of t1 to be an initial point to compute the minimum of f at a slightly larger value of the time. Okay, so so let me try to. Do I have some? Let me try to add one page here. Okay, so main idea of main idea of path following methods. Okay, so you start from x star of t1. So I'm going to assume this is given. This is easy to find. It's not so easy, but I'm just going to assume it's given. And then use x star of t1 as an initial point to compute x star of t2. Okay, so for t2 larger than t1. Okay, so let me do kind of a zoom in here. So let's redraw the polyhedron. And let's draw the I have my path. Okay, and I assume that I have my x star of t1. Okay, and I want to do this to compute my x star of t2. To compute the minimizer of my function f at x star of t2. So obviously there are two kind of conflicting objectives that I have. So on the one hand, I would like to increase t2 fast so that I can reach really x star of infinity. This is my goal. Okay, so two competing goals. Okay, so one is I would like to advance. Advance t as fast as possible, to reach x star at infinity. Okay, but also the second goal is if you advance t too fast, then X star of T1 that you have will not be a good initial guess for X star of T2. In particular, what I would like to do, so I'm going to compute X star of T2 by applying Newton's method starting from X star of T1. And really what I would like to have is that X star of T1 is in the quadratic convergence region for X star of T2. Okay, so I would like, we want X star of T2 to be in the quadratic convergence region for the function f sub T2. Okay. So this means I cannot advance T, I cannot go, I mean, I cannot make a very big step from going from T1 to T2. Okay. So there, I mean, there are two competing goals, and one here has to do an analysis to understand exactly what value, how fast can I actually increase T in such a way that my increase is not too slow, and in such a way that I still remain that going from T1 to T2 that essentially the X star of T1 remains in the quadratic convergence regions of X star of T2. Okay, so typically in most path following methods, the value of T2 will actually be a constant. So T2 is going to be a certain alpha times T1, and this alpha, so alpha is bigger than 1, and it is this alpha that I want to, I don't want it to be very close to 1 because I won't be doing any progress, but I also, I want it to be large so I can make progress, but I also want it to be not too large because otherwise X star of T1 is not, as I mentioned, in the quadratic convergence region of FT2. So again, so this requires a very delicate analysis of the function ft and of Newton's method applied to f sub t. And obviously this analysis I will not do here, but it's based on some a property of ft. So some people have developed this, have done this analysis and have shown that there is a way to actually to make this advance in such a way that that trades off kind of 1 and 2, okay, and in such a way that at the end you reach an algorithm that is very efficient, okay, and so that it will that if you want to reach accuracy epsilon, that roughly it will take log 1 over epsilon to converge. Okay, so I just want to stress that this is really the main, I mean, this trade-off in how to choose exactly this alpha is really the main kind of difficulty in analyzing the interior point methods. And the theory of so-called self-concordant functions has been developed exactly to be able to analyze this setting in here. Okay, so let me just go back now to my slides. So what did I want to say? Yes, so the FT are strictly convex. Yes, it goes to F star when T goes to infinity, the minimum of FT. Yes, okay, when T is equal to 0, I mean, essentially, if you forget just about C transpose X and you just minimize the log of BI minus AI transpose X, that's something called the analytic center of the polyhedron. Okay, it doesn't, I mean, it's a name that's usually used in this literature. So, so again, I mean, the general structure of a path following method is as follows. So essentially the idea is I want to trace this path of X star of T. So I start from an initial T0, okay, and while the desired accuracy is not reached, I update T, so I move, I let T plus to be equal to alpha T, and I perform Newton steps starting from X to compute X star of T plus, okay? And here the hope is, so here alpha is chosen so that, okay, X is in the quadratic convergence region of ft plus. Okay, so typically the number of Newton steps that you need to do will be very small. So actually in most implementation, we just do 1 Newton step. Okay, and then you do this, and so you keep updating T. And then obviously another question that one has to answer is how far do you have to go in T to reach a certain desired accuracy epsilon? And again, this is based on some of the technical, I mean, I mean, it requires a bit of technical details into understanding the properties of this function and so on. But essentially, there is a very good answer to such questions, that we know exactly when we can stop. Because in fact, we can, along the way, we can actually construct dual feasible points. That's certified.
Sorry, we have lost the sound.
And semi-definite programs. So the idea, what you just have to do is to find what is this log term that you'll have to add to account for these quadratic constraints, or for the positive semi-definite constraint. So in the case of quadratic program, this is the barrier function that you use. So you use a minus log of t squared minus the L2 norm squared. And in the case of a positive semi-definite constraint, you use again some log function, so minus the log of the determinant of x. So both functions here have the property that they go to infinity at the boundary of the corresponding region. So here, the minus log of t squared minus norm of x squared goes to infinity when you reach the boundary of this this constraint set, and the minus log that of x goes to infinity as well when x becomes singular. So when x approaches the boundary of the set of positive semi-definite matrices. Okay, so this is kind of all I wanted to say about path following methods. So now, I mean, now I can probably conclude this short course. So so we've talked mostly about first order methods in this short course, and they are very useful for a very simple very simple reason, is that the iterations are very simple, okay, and they just involve vector additions, sometimes matrix multiplications if you, I mean, matrix vector multiplications if you have kind of a least squares problem or something. But they scale to very large problem sizes for this reason, that the iterates are very simple to write down. And that's why they have become extremely useful. Now, this morning and today, I talked about another option to solve these problems if your problem is not of huge and very large size. So if your problem is of moderate size, then you can very easily formulate your problem as a linear program or as a quadratic program and use existing algorithms based on Newton's method, like this path following method I mentioned. So I do not recommend implementing a path following method. You should instead use the existing implementations. They're much more robust typically. Okay, so there are many topics that we did not cover. I mean, optimization is a huge area. So for example, there are certain non-smooth methods I did not talk about, something called the mirror descent method, which is an alternative to the subgradient method and which kind of tries to adapt a bit to the geometry of the problem. There is an idea of smoothing developed by Nesterov again, which is you take a non-smooth function and you construct a smooth approximation of it, and you apply the gradient method or the fast gradient method to it, and then you can get good rates with this method. And there's also something called bundle methods, which also have a very good practical performance. So obviously, another kind of major topic of optimization for data science is stochastic gradient methods. So these are methods that are used when the function that you want to minimize is typically written as an average or as a summation of a very large number of functions. So think, for example, of millions of functions, and here each I, I mean, in the machine learning setting, each I really corresponds to one element of your training set. Okay, and you want to minimize the overall loss. And taking the gradient of such a function would involve taking the gradient of all the FIs, and so involves taking a whole pass over the training set. And this can be very costly. So what people use is that you essentially just sample one or a few of these I's at random, and you just take the gradient of this very small sample of your function. Okay, and you use this to go to the next iterate. And so there's a very large literature on stochastic gradient methods and their convergence and so on. Another topic is distributed optimization. How do you do optimization if you have multiple computers, and how do you communicate? How do you distribute the tasks and so on and so forth? How do you do the essentially parallel optimization? Okay, and obviously there are many more topics. I mentioned optimization is a very big topic. So I guess this is all I wanted to say. So thank you all for your attendance, and I hope the course was useful for you. Okay, and I guess, yeah, so I will stop here, and if you have questions, just please ask in the chat. I'll try to answer if I can.
Thank you very much, Hamza. There are a lot of questions.
Okay.
As you see, I think the first one starts at 2:39 by Sherqawi.
Yes.
About what happens if we drop K-Lipschitz condition, and then there are following questions. So please.
So yeah, so if we drop the K-Lipschitz condition, we replace strongly convex by another condition, like strongly M convex, does it change the result? So yes, I mean, there are, this quadratic convergence, I guess you're referring to the quadratic convergence, this one. So indeed here I'm assuming that F is M strongly convex and that the Hessian is big M Lipschitz. And I said that this is one of the, I mean, I'm assuming strong conditions on F, just to make the proof simple and to give you kind of an idea of, I mean, give you some justification of this. But there are indeed other assumptions that one can put and still prove quadratic convergence. I do not know all of them, so I cannot really say exactly which ones you put, but I can tell you that the ones that are needed to analyze these path following methods are based on, do not typically require strong convexity, they just require strict convexity. And they are based, so they are based on something called self-concordance. Okay, so for self-concordant function, maybe let's let me write it here. Okay, so self-concordant functions. Okay, so this is a class of functions for which we have a very good understanding of Newton's method. Okay. Of Newton's method. Okay. So one drawback of this analysis I did with strong convexity and so on is that this analysis is not is basis dependent. Whereas we've seen that Newton's method is basis independent. So what I mean by this is that I use some specific norms in my analysis, whereas a good analysis should not use norms and should be kind of basis independent. And for self-concordant functions, that is the case. So I invite you to have a look at this. And otherwise, also there are more there are specialized results on Newton's method that I mean, I do not know all these results, but yeah, I hope that helps. I mean, self-concordant functions cover in particular this function, this minus log of sum of the minus sum of log of bi minus I transpose x. These are all self-concordant functions. Okay, so yes, so when t is equal to 0, how is ft defined? Yes, so sorry, so ft is actually defined. I mean, you can rescale by t, it doesn't really matter. So for f0, f0 is really defined as minus the sum from I equals 1 to m of log of bi minus ai transpose x. Okay. I mean, or that is really t times f0. And you take t going to 0. So, but this is really what I mean by t is equal to 0. It's really t going to 0. Okay, so let's see. Yes, so yes, so actually T, I mean, just to add, so Abdurrahman, you put a comment. So indeed, T is we expect T to actually be going to infinity. But yeah, I mean, I just mentioned in the slide that the case T is equal to 0. I mean, when you kind of actually forget about the linear function, this has a name, it's called the analytic center, but I mean, it's, yeah, it's, what is the advantage to use log to define ft and not any other function? The reason essentially is because log we have a very good analysis of this barrier function involving the log. Okay, it's a self-concordant function. We have very good analysis of the behavior of Newton's method for this function. Why they name the method you explain interior point method? Because it goes through the interior. Okay, so because you trace. Because you go from the interior of the polyhedron, and this is in contrast to the simplex method, which goes from which just works on the boundary of the polyhedron. You jump from one extreme point to another extreme point. Okay, xk in the interior of the polyhedron just at the last iteration, x star in the boundary. No, so indeed x star of t will never be on the boundary, but it will get very close to it. Okay, so you will converge to it when t goes to infinity. Okay, so that's I mean it's a limit, I think. Okay, can you give us some ideas about bundle method, because I learned about it but it didn't get the idea. Okay, so yes, I can explain briefly. So the bundle method, let's see. So, okay, very briefly, what you do is, so the bundle method is, let's say, so you want to minimize a function, f of x. Okay, so the idea is that you can, the main idea in a bundle method is to understand that if f is convex, so bundle methods have been defined for convex functions, really. So if f is convex, okay, and I have a certain set of points xi, okay, so xi is a set in Rn, okay, then I can construct a lower bound on f, okay, then f of x is bigger than the max over all I, in 1 up to, let's say, big. Let's say that your bundle has size big, okay, of f of xi plus some gi transpose x minus xi. Okay, so you can construct what we call a polyhedral model for your function. So let's say that if your function was, if I'm in one dimension, okay, and if your points are, let's say I have x1 and I have x2 and I have x3, okay, then the polyhedral model, the thing that you have in here, okay, it is a piecewise linear function. So it is constructed as follows. So you construct this guy, and this guy, and this guy. Okay, and so the function is really, it's really this. The polyhedral approximation is really this function, and this function. So this is what we call the bundle. I mean, these points, the xi's are the bundle, okay? And from a certain bundle xi, you can construct a model, a lower bound on your function. So the idea of bundle methods is really, so maybe before talking about the bundle method, the simplest method that was proposed for non-smooth functions is as follows: is let's say that you start with a certain points xi, you compute the minimum of your model of this green function, and then you add this point to your bundle, you construct a better model for f, and then you iterate. You keep doing this. Unfortunately, the performance of this method is very slow. So the bundle method is a way to actually fix this problem. So what you do is that you kind of add a certain regularization term. You don't minimize always your model, but you minimize your model plus a certain L2 term. And to make this actually work, the method becomes quite complicated. I mean, you need to analyze something called null steps and serious steps and so on. It's kind of not a very easy method. but it seems to work quite well in practice, even though you have to tune a little bit some of the parameters. There's a simpler simpler bundle method, which is called the level bundle method. Level bundle method, which has a relatively simple explanation and a simple analysis as well. And it was developed by Nesterov, Nemirovsky, and Lomarishan. Okay, so let's see, any questions? Are not exact penalty methods more efficient than interior point methods? Yes, I mean, they are an alternative, but I mean, interior point methods are currently the methods of choice for LPs and QPs. They are really the state-of-the-art methods currently that are implemented in most packages that you have. Oh, I see. How can we get P star for plotting the behavior? I can't tell you. I mean, I don't know. I mean, in all the plots I did for this course, I used I mean, for these problems of lasso and regression and so on, I actually solved them using CVX. I mean, using linear programming and so on to get P star so I don't know. I mean, in general, if you don't know it, then yeah, it's difficult to get. Yes, so okay, the question about the log, I already answered it. So it's because log, we understand very well its properties and we have very good analysis and so on. I mean, probably people maybe have tried something else, but log is typically the function that is typically used in, yeah. Yes, okay. Okay, I guess that's it. So thank you. I mean, I'm happy to read these comments, and yes, I hope the course was useful.
Thank you very much, Professor Fawzi. It was a real pleasure to follow your lectures.
Yeah, no problem. It was a pleasure for me as well.
There are videos on the UMCSP website, on Al-Khwarizmi Institute website. I shall stop the live streaming now. Thank you for live streamers.